Hi, I'm Liz Kerr, and I've recently finished my PhD at the Natural History Museum in Paris. So I'll be talking to you about some of those results on the Holocene of Western Europe and on wood mice. So Holocene being now, and one of the most interesting results comes from the most post-medieval period, so the recent now. So the landscape in Western Europe has been drastically transformed throughout the Holocene, primarily due to human activity, primarily agriculture. So from zooarchaeological studies, we know that this has altered the biodiversity, zooarchaeology being animal bones from anthropological contexts. So there are species that display synanthropic behavior, so that means that they readily exploit human transformed landscapes, both extensive and intensive, depending on the species. So we know that there's changes in biodiversity and also possibly behavioral changes in native species, but are there also changes in the functional ecology and the functional morphology of these species in response to the changes imposed by humans? So the landscape changes primarily consisted of deforestation and various types of landscape structuring, and this would have altered the selection pressure. The species that I studied is Apodamus sylvaticus and also Apodamus flavicollis, which were chosen because micromammals are a very good model, as they have a high turnover rate, and so they are very responsive to environmental changes. And also being small, the skeletal elements are more likely to be preserved whole, which is very useful if you want to do any type of biomechanical analysis. And also these species were found, they were common both before and after the agriculture was introduced into Europe. So it's good to see whether or not they respond. And the skeletal element that I looked at was the mandible, as this is very closely linked to the biomechanical function of mastication, which is linked to diet, which is a good indicator of their ecology. So is there any functional change, is there any shape change in the mandible shape, and does that shape change reflect any functional change in their mastication? So the methods that I used were GMM with 2D landmarks, 2D because it was more accessible and less expensive. And because of the fragmentation of the specimens, I used 3 different landmark sets to try to maximize the amount of shape that I could analyze and also the number of samples that I could use. So there's the 2 larger landmark sets were for the biomechanical analysis as well. So I had to include the articular condyle in that because it acts as the fulcrum with the skull. And the top one includes the angular process, and the bottom one includes the coronoid. You notice that the tips are missing because they almost always are, so we had to make do with that. And then the last landmark set was very minimal in order to try to maximize the number of sites that I could include in the sample sizes, which I won't be talking about because it wasn't very informative, but I tried it out anyway. So as you might know, the coronoid is where the temporal muscles will insert, and then the angular is where the masseter and the pterygoid muscles will insert. So also the shape of those regions might tell us something about the function in that respect. The biomechanical model was a relatively simple lever model. So like I mentioned, the articular condyle acts as a fulcrum, and then you measure the effect of the direction of the muscle action on the different processes. And then I analyzed it in respect to 3 different bite points. So the molar 1, the molar 3, and the incisor. And for the sake of consistency and simplicity, I actually placed the bite points on the alveolar level, since the teeth are often missing and you're not exactly certain how they fit. So that way I could compare it consistently between the specimens, between the samples. So my material mostly comes from France. There's 1 site from Spain. There was a little bit of pre-Holocene material that was thrown in there, and then Paleolithic and Mesolithic before the introduction of agriculture. Agriculture was introduced into Western Europe at about the end of the 6th, beginning of the 5th millennium BC. and some Bronze Age material, Iron Age, Antiquity, Medieval, Post-Medieval. So not all of these sites I could include in the biomechanical analysis, so these are the sites that I was able to include into the more complete landmark sets. In order to increase the in order to take advantage of the specimens I have, increased the sample sizes, I pooled the sites into 5 groups based off of climactic and anthropological events. So the first cutoff point was the beginning of the Holocene. So there's pre-Holocene material from some of the late interstatals at the very end. So these are non-homologous to the Holocene ecology. But they were only in the landmark set that included the smallest number of landmarks, so I won't actually be mentioning them at all. And then the next is the early Holocene material, so before the introduction of agriculture. And then early agriculture, I grouped the Neolithic and the Bronze Age together. The Iron Age justified its own sample because it was the most geographically comprehensive and it had the largest sample size. And there's also interesting things happening in the Iron Age. So there's more regional integration in terms of agriculture activity rather than just subsistence agriculture. So more trade and networking, and also certain technological things like millstones and scythes, sickles, possibly. And then the post-Iron Age material was also grouped together. Then the archaeological material was then I compared to present-day material, both from the same geographical region and across Europe, to try to compare it to a variety of different modern ecological types. But I won't be talking about the stuff from Eastern Europe in this talk. So the results, the PCA on the shape variation of the archaeological and the present-day material from Western Europe. So as you can see, is that all of the archaeological material more or less overlaps. And then the present-day material there, suddenly all of that appears. So along PC1 here, on the positive end of PC1 axis is the gray outline here, which I hope you can see. So the more vaguely archaeological end has a more vertical anterior edge, the coronoid, and also a slightly more robust M1. For the angular landmark set, we see generally the same thing happening. And then, so along the positive end of PC1 here, the gray is the positive end with a longer articular condyle. And then CVA, so comparing the differences between the defined groups and obviously the present day separates the most. So all of the groups were significantly different on Procrustes distances, which is the actual shape distance between the groups, except for the early agricultural material for the coronoid wasn't different from any of the other archaeological groups. And along the CV1, not only does the present-day material separate, but there also appears to be a somewhat chronological shift. So here, that's the post-Iron Age, Iron Age, early agricultural, and pre-agricultural. And so the shape, and then on the Malinobis distances, oh sorry, I've got that the wrong way around. They were all different on the Malinobis distances, and then on the Procrustes differences, the only groups within the archaeological groups that were different from each other was on the coronoid, and that was the Iron Age and the post-Iron Age. So in terms of shape distances, shape changes, for both landmark sets, we see that the older material has a longer articular condyle. And also the angular, the older material appears to have a broader angular, and once again on the coronoid, a more vertical edge to the anterior coronoid. So when we remove the present day group to try to remove that skewing, we still see a chronological trend on at least one of the two first canonical variant axes. So post-Iron Age, early agricultural, pre-agricultural. And also the pre-agricultural appears to be a little bit further apart. There, the Iron Age is doing something a little bit different on the non-chronological axis, which might be some sort of geographical thing happening. Once again, the only two groups that are different from each other on Procrustes distances are the Iron Age and the post-Iron Age for the coronoid. How am I doing on time? Okay, good. So, yeah. So once again, on the angular, we can see that the older specimens have a longer articular. Oh, sorry. The coronoid, it's less clear exactly what's going on. There's a very subtle, it's a little bit more vertical, but it's not very clear. So the results of the lever model. So I just generalized and I took the average shape of all of the archaeological specimens because they overlap so much, and all of the present day specimens. I'm going back over that and comparing each of the different time periods to the present day. But the general results for those is that the present day specimens have a lower mechanical potential than the archaeological shape. And so that indicates that the present day wood mice appear to have a lower potential for producing a higher bite force, and that was the case for both of the two landmark sets, and which might be consistent between them partly because it appears to be largely due to having the longer articular condyle. However, the shape differences that we saw generally between the ancient historic wood mice and the present day also seem to link into that, so that the more vertical coronoid would provide a better lever angle for the temporalis, and the broader angular could also possibly provide a greater insertion area for the masseter and pterygoid. So we don't have the soft tissue, but we can infer from those shape changes that might have also contributed to having a greater bite force. So the whole Holocene, there's not very much going on unless we compare the differences between defined groups. So the only really visible shape change that we see is happened somewhere between my most recent archaeological specimen, which is in the 16th century, and now. And I assume that that must be due to the Industrial Revolution. So what would be the implications in terms of the ecology of the wood mice for having a reduced capacity for producing a higher bite force? These are highly omnivorous species which have a tendency to disperse seasonally, so they exploit a lot of different types of microhabitats. The most obvious implication is that they would reduce their dietary range, so they would no longer be able to eat the harder food items. That could either be because they are no longer have access to those food items, or they no longer need to access those food items, which both could be due to a reduction in the microhabitat, so a homogenization of the landscape, and also increased monoculture. And there was a subtle chronological change throughout the Holocene, but that is very negligible when you compare it to what was happening in the post-medieval period. So what are the implications and future questions that I'd like to investigate? So at what point during the post-medieval period did this happen? Did it happen at when field sizes became larger, at the introduction of machines, at the introduction of pesticides, at the synergistic interaction with climate change? And this relates to data that we have about the way the ecology has been changing in the last couple hundred years, but we know that there's been dramatic changes in biodiversity. It's also interesting because if the ecological niche of wood mice is fundamentally different from the post-medieval period onwards compared to the rest of the Holocene, then ever since modern science existed, the landscape that we've been studying is fundamentally altered from what existed for most of the Holocene, at least in respect to wood mice. And this has implications for how we might consider conservation in the future. So what do we need to do in order to maintain the integrity of the landscape? Also, another interesting thing would be to look at other species. So Apodibus might be a relatively robust species ecologically, and it really took something big in order to make it change. Shrews might be more sensitive to changes in precipitation, so climatic variation throughout the Holocene, so it might be interesting to see whether they change a bit more. And I'd like to thank all of these people, particularly my supervisors, Anne Tressé and Anthony Harrell and Raphael Cornett, people who lent me material and helped me with methods, and also the Jones Finley Memorial Fund for helping me come here. And thank you for listening.